The piece of paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn soft, like fabric, written in careful blue ballpoint pen. The numbers seemed to shimmer with possibility. 557294. Susan Miller's phone number, copied from the school directory with the kind of precision usually reserved for homework assignments or grocery lists. But this wasn't homework. This was something far more terrifying and wonderful. David Thompson sat at the kitchen table in his family's modest bungalow on Birch Street, staring at those 7 digits that represented everything his 16-year-old heart had been building toward for the past 3 months. It was a Thursday evening in October 1971, and the yellow rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall seemed to be looking back at him with the patient authority of a judge waiting for a verdict. The phone itself was a substantial presence in the kitchen, a solid piece of technology that had served the Thompson family faithfully for nearly a decade. Its handset was heavy in the hand, connected to the base by a coiled cord that stretched just far enough to allow someone to lean against the counter or pace nervously within a small radius. The rotary dial was a perfect circle of numbers and letters, each position requiring a deliberate clockwise turn until your finger met the metal finger stop, then a wait while the dial returned to its starting position with a series of mechanical clicks that could be heard throughout the house. David had been thinking about this phone call for weeks, ever since that afternoon in study hall when Susan had smiled at him in a way that seemed to suggest she might, possibly, hopefully, be interested in talking to someone like him. They had been assigned to the same history project, and their conversations about the War of 1812 had gradually evolved into something that felt like flirting, though David wasn't entirely sure, since his experience with flirting was limited to theoretical knowledge gleaned from observing older boys and the occasional romantic scene in movies. The problem was that calling a girl required navigating a complex social and technological landscape that seemed designed to test the resolve of even the most determined teenage suitor. First, there was the matter of timing. Calling too early might interrupt the family dinner, calling too late might seem presumptuous, and calling during prime television hours could result in a chilly reception from whoever answered the phone. Then there was the question of what to say if Susan's parents answered, which they probably would, since families typically shared one phone line and parents tended to be protective of their daughters' social interactions. Most challenging of all was the knowledge that this conversation, if it happened, would take place with David's own family as an unavoidable audience. The kitchen phone was the family's only communication link to the outside world, positioned in the heart of their home where privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. His mother would be preparing tomorrow's school lunches at the counter just feet away. His father would be reading the evening paper in his chair within easy hearing distance, and his 13-year-old sister Carol would undoubtedly find some reason to wander through the kitchen repeatedly during any conversation that sounded remotely interesting. David had been rehearsing what he would say for days, running through different conversational scenarios while walking to school, during math class, and in those moments before sleep when the mind tends to explore its most pressing concerns. He had considered various opening lines, casual references to their history project, questions about upcoming school events, observations about teachers they shared, but every option seemed either too obvious or too obscure, too eager or too indifferent. The reality was that David had never called a girl before, not for romantic purposes. He had made plenty of phone calls to friends about homework assignments, to his grandmother on Sundays, to the hardware store to check if they had whatever part his father needed for some household repair project. But those calls had clear purposes and predictable outcomes. This call was venturing into uncharted territory where the stakes felt enormous and the possibility of embarrassment seemed limitless. He looked again at the piece of paper, then at the phone, then back at the paper. The kitchen was filled with the familiar sounds of Thursday evening, his mother running water in the sink, the gentle clatter of dishes being washed and dried, the murmur of the television program his father was watching in the living room. These sounds, usually comforting, now seemed like obstacles to overcome, reminders that his most vulnerable moment would be performed in front of an audience he couldn't dismiss. His mother, Margaret, glanced over from the sink where she was washing the dinner dishes. She had probably noticed his nervous energy, the way he had been sitting at the table with unusual stillness, but she was tactful enough not to comment directly. Instead, she simply continued with her evening routine, humming softly to herself as she worked. "Mum," David said finally, his voice carrying the kind of artificial casualness that teenagers use when they're trying to seem nonchalant about something that matters enormously. "Is it okay if I make a phone call?" Margaret looked up from the dish she was drying, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had been 16 once herself, had experienced her own nervous phone calls and first romantic stirrings. She could probably read the situation with the kind of maternal intuition that saw through teenage subterfuge as easily as looking through clear glass. "Of course," she said, hanging the dish towel on its hook by the sink. "I'll just finish up here and give you some space." This offer of privacy was both a gift and a source of additional pressure. If his mother was clearing the kitchen, it meant she understood the significance of this call, which somehow made it feel even more momentous. David nodded his thanks, waiting until she had gathered her things and moved toward the living room before approaching the phone with the careful deliberation of someone defusing a bomb. The rotary dial felt cool under his finger as he began the familiar ritual of placing a call. The dial turned smoothly clockwise until his finger met the stop, then returned to its starting position with a series of clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "5 call." Again, the same smooth motion, the same mechanical return. "5 call." A third time, and David realized he had been holding his breath. 7. The dial seemed heavier now, or perhaps his finger was less steady. The clicking of the mechanism as it returned to position sounded different, more significant, as if the phone itself understood that this was not a routine call about homework or family business. 2. David's palms were beginning to perspire, making the plastic handset feel slippery in his grip. He could hear the faint electrical sounds that preceded the completion of a call, the subtle clicking and humming that indicated the telephone system was processing his request, connecting his kitchen to Susan Miller's house across town. 9. The dial felt heavier still, and David found himself wondering if it was possible to dial too slowly, if there was some time limit after which the phone system would give up and require him to start over. The thought of having to repeat this process was almost unbearable. 4. The final number, and now there was nothing to do but wait and listen as the phone began to ring on the other end. The ringing sound, a distant, tinny double ring that was transmitted through miles of wire and mechanical switching equipment, seemed to echo in David's chest as well as in his ear. 1 ring. David found himself hoping that no one would answer, that he could hang up and postpone this terrifying moment for another day when he felt braver or more prepared or had thought of something clever to say. 2 rings. Now he found himself hoping desperately that someone would answer, because hanging up after multiple rings would be cowardly, and besides, Susan might recognize his voice if she answered, which would be the best possible outcome. 3 rings. David was beginning to worry that the Millers weren't home, which would mean he would have to go through this entire process again later, probably multiple times until he finally reached someone. 4 rings. Just as David was beginning to think about hanging up, he heard the distinctive click that indicated someone had picked up the phone on the other end. "Hello?" The voice was female, but David couldn't immediately tell if it was Susan or her mother. The telephone's audio quality made voices sound different than they did in person, and his nervousness was affecting his ability to process familiar sounds. "Hello," David replied, his voice sounding strange to himself, higher and more tentative than usual. Is Susan there, please?" There was a pause that seemed to last forever, but probably lasted only a few seconds. David could hear sounds in the background. Television, perhaps someone talking in another room, the familiar domestic sounds that filled family homes during the evening hours. "Just a minute," the voice said, and David realized with relief that it was Susan's mother, which meant Susan was probably home and available to come to the phone. He could hear Mrs. Miller calling Susan's name, her voice becoming distant as she moved away from the phone. The waiting that followed was excruciating. David could hear muffled sounds through the receiver, footsteps, perhaps a door closing, the distant sound of voices having a conversation he couldn't quite make out. He found himself wondering what Susan was thinking when her mother told her there was a boy on the phone for her, wondering if she would be pleased or surprised or perhaps annoyed by the interruption. "Hello?" Susan's voice was unmistakable now, carrying the slight breathlessness of someone who had hurried to the phone. David felt his heart rate increase significantly, as if his body was preparing for some kind of athletic competition rather than a simple conversation. "Hi, Susan. It's David. David Thompson, from history class." "Oh, hi, David." The warmth in her voice was immediately reassuring, suggesting that she was pleased rather than annoyed to hear from him. "How are you doing?" This simple question, which David had anticipated and prepared for, suddenly seemed impossible to answer in any meaningful way. How was he doing? He was terrified, exhilarated, nervous, hopeful, and completely uncertain about what to say next. But none of those responses seemed appropriate for casual phone conversation. "I'm good," he said instead, falling back on the safe territory of conventional politeness. I was wondering about our history project, about the research part.
This was the pretext David had settled on, a legitimate school-related reason for calling that could provide a foundation for conversation without making his romantic intentions too obvious. It was cowardly, perhaps, but it felt safer than simply admitting he had called because he couldn't stop thinking about her. "Oh, the project." Susan's voice carried genuine interest, and David felt a small surge of confidence. "I've been thinking about that too. I found some really interesting stuff at the library about the Battle of Queenston Heights. Did you know that Isaac Brock was only 42 when he died?" The conversation that followed was easier than David had expected, partly because they genuinely did need to discuss their project, but mostly because Susan seemed genuinely happy to talk with him. They covered the required territory of research assignments and presentation deadlines, but the conversation gradually expanded to include other topics: teachers they shared, upcoming school events, books they were reading, television shows they watched. David found himself relaxing as the conversation progressed, his initial nervousness giving way to something approaching normal social interaction.
Susan was easy to talk to, asking questions that showed she was listening, sharing observations that made him laugh, creating the kind of conversational rhythm that made time pass without notice. It was during a discussion about their favorite television shows that David realized they had been talking for nearly 20 minutes and that his nervousness had been replaced by something much more dangerous: genuine enjoyment. He was having fun, and more importantly, Susan seemed to be having fun too. Her laughter came easily, and she had begun sharing personal opinions and preferences rather than sticking to safe topics like schoolwork. "I can't believe you like the Partridge Family," David said, genuinely surprised by this revelation. "I thought only little kids watched that show." "Hey, it's better than the Brady Bunch," Susan replied, her voice carrying the kind of mock indignation that suggested she was enjoying the gentle teasing. "At least David Cassidy can actually sing." This led to a debate about the relative merits of various television performers, which somehow evolved into a discussion about music, which revealed that they had similar tastes in songs and radio stations. David found himself sharing opinions he hadn't known he had, discovering preferences and attitudes that seemed to emerge naturally in response to Susan's questions and observations. "Do you ever listen to CKLW?" Susan asked, referencing the Detroit radio station that many Canadian teenagers tuned in to hear the latest American hits. "All the time," David replied, "especially late at night when the signal comes in really clear. They play songs you never hear on the local stations." "I know. My parents think it's too loud, but if you use headphones, you can listen without bothering anyone. Sometimes I fall asleep listening to music." This image, Susan lying in her bedroom, listening to music through headphones in the darkness, struck David as impossibly romantic and intimate. The thought that they might have been listening to the same songs at the same time, separated by miles but connected by radio waves, seemed to suggest a kind of destiny that made this phone call feel like the natural progression of something that had been building without their conscious awareness. As the conversation continued, David became aware that his initial goals for this phone call had been completely exceeded. He had hoped simply to have a conversation without embarrassing himself, to perhaps establish that Susan enjoyed talking with him, but what was happening was much more significant. They were discovering that they genuinely liked each other, that their personalities were compatible in ways that went beyond their shared interest in history projects. "I should probably let you go," David said finally, partly because he could hear his family moving around in other parts of the house, and partly because he sensed that ending the conversation while it was going well might be more strategic than letting it drag on until they ran out of things to say. "Okay," Susan replied, but her voice carried a note of reluctance that suggested she was enjoying the conversation as much as he was. "Thanks for calling about the project, and it was fun." "Yeah, it was," David agreed, and he meant it completely. "Maybe we could, if you want to talk more about the project, or anything else, I could call again sometime." "I'd like that," Susan said, and something in her voice suggested she meant more than just project collaboration. "Or maybe we could talk at school too, not just about history." This invitation to expand their relationship beyond the confines of academic cooperation felt like a victory beyond David's most optimistic expectations. He had called hoping to have a conversation, but Susan was suggesting something more: an ongoing connection, a reason to seek each other out, a foundation for whatever might develop between them. "I'd really like that," David said, and heard in his own voice a confidence that hadn't been there when he first dialed her number. "I'll see you tomorrow in history class." "See you tomorrow," Susan replied, and the warmth in her voice carried a promise that tomorrow would be different from today, that this phone call had changed something between them in a way that would continue beyond the moment they hung up. "Bye, Susan." "Bye, David." David held the receiver for a moment after hearing the click that indicated Susan had hung up, as if he could preserve the connection by not quite letting go. When he finally returned the handset to its cradle, the kitchen seemed different, brighter, somehow, full of possibility in a way it hadn't been an hour earlier. His mother appeared in the doorway, carrying a load of laundry and wearing the kind of carefully neutral expression that parents use when they're trying not to seem too interested in their children's romantic developments. "How did your call go?" she asked, her tone suggesting casual interest rather than maternal surveillance. "Good," David said, and realized that this simple word was completely inadequate to describe what had just happened. "Really good." Margaret smiled, the kind of knowing smile that suggested she remembered exactly what really good meant when applied to first phone calls with someone special. She didn't ask for details, understanding intuitively that some experiences needed to be preserved in the private spaces of a teenager's heart before they could be shared, even with sympathetic family members. "I'm glad," she said simply, continuing through the kitchen toward the laundry room, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the warm glow of successful connection. As David sat in the quiet kitchen, looking at the phone that had been the instrument of this small miracle, he understood that something fundamental had changed in his life. Not just in his relationship with Susan, though that was certainly part of it, but in his understanding of his own capabilities, his ability to take risks, to reach across the uncertain space between himself and another person, and discover that connection was possible. In the weeks and months that followed, David and Susan would have many more phone conversations, some about homework and school projects, others about music and television, and the hundreds of small discoveries that marked the development of teenage friendship and romance. They would learn each other's voices as well as they knew each other's faces, would develop the kind of easy conversational intimacy that comes from regular communication and growing trust. But none of those future conversations would carry the particular magic of this first one, the courage it had required, the uncertainty it had resolved, the door it had opened to possibilities that had only existed in David's imagination until he found the bravery to dial those 7 numbers and speak his interest into the world. Years later, when David and Susan were married and had teenagers of their own, they would remember this phone call as the moment their relationship truly began. Not in the history class where they first met, not during the project they worked on together, but on a Thursday evening in October when a nervous 16-year-old boy overcame his fear of rejection and discovered that sometimes, if you're brave enough to reach out, someone reaches back. The rotary phone that had made that connection possible would eventually be replaced by push-button phones, then cordless phones, then cellular phones that made communication easier and more private. But no technology that followed would quite capture the particular courage required to make a call on a kitchen wall phone, with family members as witnesses, and the mechanical precision of rotary dialing to slow down the process and force callers to commit fully to each digit, each decision, each moment of connection. That night, as David lay in bed replaying every moment of his conversation with Susan, he understood that he had crossed some invisible line between childhood and whatever came next. He had taken a risk, declared an interest, made himself vulnerable to rejection, and discovered that sometimes vulnerability is rewarded with exactly the kind of connection the heart hopes for, but hardly dares to expect. The piece of paper with Susan's phone number, now worn soft from handling, remained tucked in his wallet for years afterward, not because he needed it for reference, since he had memorized those digits the first night he copied them down, but as a reminder of the evening when 7 numbers had represented infinite possibility and courage had been rewarded with the sweetest of surprises. The voice on the other end saying yes, she'd like to talk again, and yes, tomorrow would be different because of tonight.